Coronavirus is changing the rhythms of life, including how people prepare for birth and say goodbye in death. In this week's episode, Into America went to the San Francisco Bay Area to speak with Victoria Andrade, who's 36 weeks pregnant with her first child. As a nurse herself, Victoria knows that birth plans can change quickly, so she tried to keep things simple. Her priority was to have her partner and her mother by her side when she delivered the baby. But 2 weeks ago, Victoria learned the hospital was taking extra precautions because of risk of coronavirus and is now only allowing one person in the room when she delivers the baby. Now, Victoria is worried that even that could change and that she might have to have the baby without any family by her side.
When you're in pain or when you're going through this experience, you need someone to help be your advocate, your voice. You need someone, not only there to encourage you, but sometimes you do need someone to speak for you. And to not have that person there is really hard to swallow. If something, God forbid, were to happen to me or the baby, you want your partner to be there to help make those hard decisions, If there's a time where I'm incapacitated, my baby is going to be alone.
While some are preparing to welcome a new life during this pandemic, others are figuring out how to grieve. MSNBC contributor Eric Deggans grew up in Gary, Indiana. It's also where his mother, Carolyn Williams, sang in the local church choir for 60 years. She died at the age of 81. Earlier this month, Miss Carolyn ended up in the hospital after a really bad fall. Her son Eric flew back to Gary immediately, but due to safety concerns surrounding the virus, Eric was forced to leave the hospital for the 4 days leading up to her death. He was only permitted to be by her side for her final hours.
I know she was frightened. I know she was scared. We talked about that before I left. And that also concerns me.
That she spent some of her final days scared.
Yeah. And alone. Sitting in a hospital room by herself. These guidelines created a situation where the church family that she had supported for 60 years couldn't really be there for her physically in that moment. The son that she had supported for 54 years couldn't be there for her in those last few days. And it's continuing. We're going to be allowed a maximum of 10 people in the sanctuary when we hold the funeral tomorrow. That's including the people who work at the church.
The funeral was live streamed. Let's stop for a moment and let that sink in. Saying goodbye over the internet.
Start by welcoming all those who are viewing this homegoing service online, where we've come to celebrate the life, legacy of Sister Carol Williams.
And there was no shared meal after the services, no lingering in the parking lot telling old stories, and no choir.
There can't even be a choir. There can't even be a choir to sing for a woman who sang in a church choir for 60 years.
Eric hopes that once the coronavirus has been contained, he can hold a bigger service and give his mother the proper homegoing that she deserves. To hear more of Eric and Victoria's stories, check out our most recent episode of Into America. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.